Hi, my name is Marco DeGiovanni. I am very pleased to have the opportunity to speak with you here today during the month of November as the OCSB recognizes Indigenous Awareness Month. It is important for us to take the time to acknowledge the original people that lived on this land before us. This act of remembering and honoring the Algonquin people of our region is an important part of reconciliation and heals the relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people in Canada. With that, I would like to recognize that our school is located on the ancestral, traditional, and unceded Indigenous territory of the Algonquin peoples, on whose territory we pray, learn, play, and work. Many of the narratives that have been explored through the NDE 3U course can be used to mentor and aid in creating counter narratives against the many inaccurate, incomplete, as well as colonialist worldviews and representations of Indigenous people. One of the first works of literature explored in the course was a poem by John Adrian MacDonald. This poem, named 37401 66701, sheds light on the residential school system and the trauma that these children experience at these schools. This is a large inaccurate representation of the Indigenous people at the fault of the Canadian government. Their perception of Indigenous people was that they would never be able to mesh properly with Canadian society. They figured by removing the cultural practices out of these children, they would be more widely accepted in Canada. A quote from the Prime Minister at the time, John A. Macdonald, shows this, as he said, "The child lives with his parents, who are savages, and though he may learn to read and write, his habits and training mode of thought are Indian. He is simply a savage who can read and write." His plan with the residential schools was to appear to be doing the country good by helping these cultures adapt into Canadian society, but in reality, he traumatized and destroyed the Indigenous cultures and traditions. A large part of Indigenous culture are the relationships and the people and the land in between those relationships. They are what form their culture. Without these relationships, these cultures would be very different from what they are today. It is said in the Cree law, known as Wakatoan, that the Cree law is the deep respect with which Cree peoples have traditionally regarded the earth, inclusive of particular geographic features such as mountains or rivers, skyward and celestial formations such as stars, plants, animals, birds, and all other manner of life. Another narrative that is explored thoroughly in the NDE 3U course is Indian Horse by Richard Wagamese. This is yet another phenomenal example of relationships between Indigenous people and how crucial they are to their culture. There are several examples of relationships in Wagamese's novel, such as when we learn about how close Saul and Father Labuche were. That is until Father betrayed their relationship and traumatized him. This demonstrates how even when an Indigenous person is in a terrible situation, they still follow and respect everyone else around them. They also have a very strong connection to the land, as seen when Saul journeys all the way back out to God's Lake for the sole purpose of healing himself with the land. It has always been viewed as a way of life for the Indigenous people, and therefore should not have been impacted by the Canadian government with the residential school system, as well as other forms of stereotypes and racism in society. This severely impacted the culture as a whole. These residential schools were the primary factor of trauma amongst young Indigenous children, and this trauma continued throughout the majority of their lives. As many people have stated before, the cultural bias, stereotypes, and misrepresentations of Indigenous people are unfair, rude, and wrong. They are destroying families and cultures. Each culture has different traditions, and no tradition is wrong nor right. Society focuses solely on themselves and their practices and beliefs, and does not recognize the different traditions of different cultures. They think that the way that they do things should be the way that everyone else does things. These are the same people who will never have as tight of a relationship as the Indigenous people because of the fact that they do not respect the relationships of Indigenous cultures. One other narrative that is explored in the course is the independent novel study. In this case, we will examine Birdie. This novel has very strong examples of relationships amongst the Indigenous population. When Bernice falls into her sleep-like state, it is the relationships she has made with her aunt, cousin, and Lola that keep her going when she wakes up from her trance. Without these relationships, Bernice would not have had anyone else to help her and look out for her when she went through her phase of reflection. At first, Bernice finds it very hard to understand why her culture insists on sticking together at all times. But when she wakes up from her trance with her friends and family surrounding her, she finally understands why. Her friends and family were helping her, worried about if she would ever come out of her sleep-like state. When she saw how relieved they were, she finally understood the importance of these relationships and why everyone has always taught her to respect the relationships that you have with people. This is a lesson that many people should learn because people do not respect the relationships they have with their friends and family. Many take these relationships for granted, and one day they won't have them anymore. The indigenous people rely heavily on relationships. However, when someone passes away, they recognize all the good times they had, and hopefully there is nothing they regret not doing sooner. They learn to never take people for granted because one day they will not be there and anymore, and they will not know where to turn after these people they took for granted are gone from their lives. This is why I believe that instead of people looking down on these practices, we should be looking up to them and seeing how we can do better ourselves. An older play explored in this course is Someday by Drew Hayden Taylor. Although it was written in the early 90s, it still has excellent examples of relationships that are still relevant today. Money is something that explored in this play when the family seems to become closer after they won the lottery. It may appear that the money has brought them closer, but in reality the money has only given this appearance because the family is selfish and hopes that they might be able to get in on some of the money. This is where money can cause lots of problems in relationships. People think that they are developing closer relationships with other people, but in reality they are only becoming closer to the money in which they desire. When the others in the relationship realize this, it could lead to severe conflict and potentially ruin the relationship between these people. While this is more common than many people may realize, it should not be able to affect the relationship and potentially have the power to rip apart families for the sole purpose of money. This is a very common reason for families to have issues, and it should not even be a factor. In an episode of Eighth Fire, called Whose Land Is It Anyway?, it examines all of the problems that Indigenous individuals face every day in getting their land back. This shows yet another example of relationships because it represents the relationship between the Indigenous people and the Canadians. Canadians ruined their relationship by essentially stealing their land and not letting them build or modify things on their own land. The government controls them. This is completely unacceptable in this day and age. Canadians are naive as to what is going on up north and on all the reserves. They don't really even want to learn about what is happening because they have it in their mind that it is not their problem. Well, it is their problem. It is their own country that is treating these people poorly for no reason whatsoever. The Indigenous people should be treated equally to everyone else. They are a part of this country's culture and should be recognized as such. Indigenous people have no freedom with what to do with their own land. The government is still controlling their lives after promising they would do everything they can to fix things between them. Another narrative is I Am My Grandmother. This journal, written by Nadia McLaren, sheds light on the relationships between Indigenous people and their elders. Indigenous people have a very special bond and connection with the land, and their elders and their ancestors. When one of these elders passes away, the people that were close to them often feel lost and that they have nowhere to turn for help. I would like to take a moment to reflect on the different treaties in Canada. In Ottawa, where we are seated right now, we are a part of the proposed Algonquins of Ontario settlement area. This treaty targets the 36,000 square kilometers of land identified as the Algonquin settlement area. The Algonquin people are doing everything they can in order to get their land back, or in the very least not have to ask permission from the government to do certain things on their own land. After all these years and everything these people have been through, they are still forced to ask the government for permission to build and modify things on their land. With all these novels that will be explored all throughout the NBE 3U course, it is very evident that relationships between Indigenous people and others as well as the land is very crucial to their culture and is very important to them. They face a lot of discrimination, and despite all of the struggles they go through, they still do their very best to be kind to everyone without asking for anything in return, other than the land that was rightfully theirs to begin with. We should not be discriminating against them in this day and age. The government needs to step up and do what is right to repair the relationship between these two parties. Going on like this, with the Indigenous people and Canadians constantly bashing heads on ideas, is not acceptable and should not be tolerated any longer. The discrimination, unfair treatment, and bias towards them. With that, I would like to thank you for your time, and I hope you will all go forward and think about all the things that we can do differently in the future in order to be more fair and unbiased towards the Native and Indigenous people. Thank you very much, and all the best.